Wormholes, particle physics, extra dimensions. Are the wonders of so-called reality really what they appear to be? Or do we exist in an elaborate hologram? Is our universe the result of random activity or the result of intelligent design? If a creator was involved, can we discover him through our perception of divine order? This is Into the Multiverse with Josh Peck.
Stay seated until the ride comes to a complete stop. It's Into the Multiverse with Josh Peck. I am your host, Josh Peck, and with me in studio, my wonderful, beautiful wife, Christina Peck. How are you?
Awesome as always. Good to be here.
It is great to be here. I'm glad that we get to do another episode, episode 3. This one on extra dimensions and Flatland. So it's going to be a fantastic topic to discuss. I guess we should probably start off with where people can find the show if they haven't searched all the outlets already. You can find it on Roku, and then do you want to give the YouTube?
Sure. You can find us on youtube.com/SkywatchTV_official, or you can go to the Skywatch homepage at skywatchtv.com.
Fantastic. Well, as I said, this episode we're going to be talking about extra dimensions and Flatland, where it's actually kind of a continuation of last week's episode, where we talked about the 2 fourth dimensions, that there's actually 2 fourth dimensions, one of space and one of time. So today we're going to be talking about extra dimensions outside of the fourth, and we're going to use Flatland as an example to illustrate that.
Right. And it's going to give everybody a deeper understanding and how to perceive higher dimensions by looking at the lower dimensions.
Yeah. I think a good place to start is probably to talk a little bit about string theory, which actually nowadays it's referred to usually as M theory or superstring theory. Back in the 90s, they had about 5 different ideas on how string theory would work, and a brilliant scientist, Edward Winton, I think was his name. He came along and was able to show that all 5 of those were right in a way. They all had a piece of the puzzle. He put them all together and came up with what we call M theory now. And as of yet, he will not disclose what the M stands for. It's kind of a running mystery. It's a mystery. That's probably what it is, too.
Mystery theory. Makes sense to me.
So in M theory, there are actually 10 dimensions of space and 1 of time. So if M theory is correct, there's 11 dimensions in total. And just last week, we were talking about how difficult it could be to visualize the 4th dimension, which we'll talk a little bit more this episode too.
And even the 5th dimension.
Yeah, but imagine up to 11.
Mm-hmm. And how we were talking about last week, how it seems that it's whimsical and spiritual in higher dimensions, but actually the higher you go, the more realistic it is.
Yeah, the more solid.
The more real, if you will.
Yeah,
you know.
I will.
You will.
Yeah, the more solid it is. So we're talking about 10 possible dimensions of space, and then 1 of time to give us 11. And there might actually be a 12th foundational or 0th dimension, which we'll get into a little bit later. But speaking of time, since we talked about that last week, there was something else that came up that I wanted to bring up. And it's a really interesting verse. It's 2 Corinthians 4:18, which says, "While we look not at the things which are seen, but at the things which are not seen. For the things which are seen are temporal, but the things which are not seen are eternal." So right there, that verse gives us a difference between temporal existence or existence in time and eternal existence or existence in eternity.
Yep, outside of time.
Outside of time, exactly. So it's not that eternity is just a long expanse of time that never ends. Eternity is actually a state that's outside of time. It's a timeless state, which of course we have no way to, all we know is time. So we have no way to comprehend that.
Everything ages with time. You see it decay, you see us age. Time has everything to do with everything. in our dimension.
Yeah, it does. We can talk about the possibility that there might be a 12th dimension or a foundational dimension. Going along with what we talked about last time, if we remember, we exist in 3 dimensions. So where that starts is at the 0 point. It's the point from which the x-axis branches off, the y-axis branches off, and the z-axis branches off. So if we go through all the dimensions and we have 11, that at least makes me wonder, what about that first point before there are any dimensions, before we even talk about the first dimension, before those first 2 lines sprout off?
Yeah, exactly. What could possibly be there? What would that be like? What would that consist of?
Yeah, it would be a single point that actually would have some kind of substance. It's called a Planck length, which will... I don't know if in this episode or some other episode.
Maybe a future episode.
Yeah, we'll get into all the Planck constant stuff, which is fascinating. But so there's something to it. It's not non-existent. So it's there, but it's not counted as a dimension.
No.
And in my book, Quantum Creation, for those interested, skywatchtvstore.com, running a deal right now where you can get both my books for $29.95, which is a $40 value. So make sure to check that out. But in that book, I talk about how it's possible this 0th dimension is the foundational dimension which everything else is built upon. And the way that I describe it in the book is, if you imagine, because time, as we talked about in the last episode, is a property of space. If we think about this as a 12 or a 10-story building, the elevator shaft that connects all 10 stories would be time. So that's like the 11th dimension. And the concrete that's poured underneath the building, that the building's resting upon, would be like this 0th.
The 0th dimension.
This foundational.
It's the point where that's how you get to all the other points. I understand. Yeah, that's very interesting. It's a interesting topic, and without it, yeah, it makes sense. You need a foundation there. You can't just start with a line.
Yeah, you gotta have a starting point.
A point. Like once that pencil hits the paper, there's first a dot, right? There's first a start. That's the starting point, and then you can make your lines.
Exactly.
So yeah, it's very interesting.
Yeah, so there might be something there. Now, Flatland. This is probably the best example that I've ever heard to explain, or at least try to help envision what higher dimensions might be like, at least by analogy. It's based on a book called Flatland, A Romance of Many Dimensions, that was written in the 1800s by author Edwin A. Abbott. And the main character in this fictional story is literally a square, and his name is A Square. And the way that Edwin A. Abbott came to that name is, A Abbott, so A square.
A square. Mm-hmm.
So it's a little play on words, but so without going too much into that, but so this main character, A Square, the first part of the story talks about what 2-dimensional life is really like. All A Square has is left, right, forward, backward, no up or down. So the main character tries to explain that. But then later on, 3-dimensional objects and entities start interacting with him. So the whole point of the story is to show how, to a Flatlander, how a higher dimensional or an extra dimensional being would come across, would look, would interact. Everything from a Flatland perspective is all based on 2-dimensional lines, or, well, really 1-dimensional lines, but their whole perception is flat, for lack of better words. So, if a ball were to pass through Flatland, what would that look like to a Flatlander? Right. First, they would see a point appear right in front of them, because they're not going to see the ball coming down because they have no up or down. So they would see a point just pop into existence out of nowhere, and they would see this point grow into a circle as the ball is passing through, and as the ball leaves, it would shrink back to a point and disappear.
Then vanish.
And then they would all have something to talk about.
Yes, and they would say that it was a UFO when they've been visited.
Well, that's interesting, because there are a lot of UFO accounts and stories about 3-dimensional objects
passing through.
showing
Yeah.
up like that, where they change shape and they change sizes, and sometimes they even split off into two different things
Yeah.
and then come back
Yeah.
together, and then they kind of seem to
Go into
shrink
one
and
then
yeah,
vanish.
and then vanish.
So yeah,
But if we use the Flatland analogy, and if those UFOs are actually extra dimensional, that's exactly what we would expect.
and it makes perfect sense that they'd be extra dimensional and not extraterrestrial.
Yeah, yeah.
It's definitely a fourth dimensional object or higher. Even it could be higher than 4 dimensions, and coming into our existence
Exactly.
and manipulating of our space.
Yeah, and that's why the Flatland example is so it's just so good. It just works so well.
It works, and it helps us understand.
Yeah, because we can understand 2-dimensional reality way more than we'd be able to try to visualize 4-dimensional reality. So if we think about what these things would be like for a Flatlander, then we can just increase 1 dimension. So instead of a circle appearing, for us it would be an actual ball. If a 4-dimensional sphere or a hypersphere were to pass through, we would just see a point somewhere in space in front of us or whatever. We'd see a point appear, and it would grow into a ball, and then as it was leaving, it would shrink. And it wouldn't even have to be moving in our space at all. It could be stationary, but it would be moving through the 4th dimension.
Exactly.
Man.
It's a mind bender. Makes you think.
It really does. We talked about the hypersphere. Now, something else that is interesting to talk about is what is called Flatland prison. And this is all different thought exercises that physicists use to try to explain some of these things. Imagine how easy it would be to put a Flatlander in prison. If they have a society and a culture, and one Flatlander breaks a Flatlander law or something, all they would have to do is make a circle or draw a circle around the Flatlander, and they would be captured. They wouldn't be able to go anywhere. But if I came along and I wanted to free the Flatlander, I could pull the Flatlander up into our third spatial dimension, move him over past the circle that was drawn around him, and put him back down next to it. To the other Flatlanders, what would that look like? The Flatlander that was in prison would look like he would just disappear. Yeah, and then reappear outside of the prison. Now, why that's important is when we look at Acts 12:7. This is Peter's big prison escape, and it's interesting. It says, well, the whole thing is about 10 verses long. I'm not going to read all that, but if we just look at verse 7, it says, "And behold, the angel of the Lord came upon him, and a light shined into the prison, and he smote Peter on the side and raised him up, saying, Arise up quickly, and his chains fell off from his hands." Now, it doesn't say this specifically, but if the 4th dimension was utilized there, I think that the chains fell through his hands.
Yeah.
It doesn't say that specifically.
But it's,
But that if the angel of the Lord was using the extra dimension to get this done.
And it's possible. Why not manipulate it? That, it's God is in a completely different place using the angel of the Lord, and it's anything is possible.
We also have Jesus possibly going through walls. Now think of this in Luke 24:36 through 39. This is when the apostles are all up in the upper room, and they're kind of waiting to find out what they're going to do next. It says, "While they were telling these things, he himself," speaking of Jesus, "stood in their midst and said to them, 'Peace be to you.' But they were startled and frightened and thought that they were seeing a spirit. And he said to them, 'Why are you troubled? And why do doubts arise in your hearts? See my hands and my feet, that is, I myself. Touch me and see. For a spirit does not have flesh and bones as you see that I have.'" So we're actually talking about, he was physical. He wasn't just a spirit here. He was a physical, I would say extra dimensional
Yes.
being, because he had his new bodies, just like we're going to have our new bodies someday.
Exactly.
And he got a perfectly closed room, and he was able to enter in and startle everybody because nobody expected that he was going to be there.
And then he sat down regularly and had a meal with them.
Yeah, exactly.
Right after that.
Amazing to think about. So if anything, more solid than we are now. Before we get too much further into this, Nita Horn has written an excellent book, and there's a great writing contest involved in this. So I want to give you some information on that. We will be right back.
To celebrate the release of Nita Horn's inspiring new book, No Fences, Skywatch TV would like you to tell your story, because after all, even if you don't think so, you actually have a story.
Send in your story, and we are going to choose the 10 best, and they'll be published for Christmas release in an anthology of those stories, along with the book that you buy that is actually only $19.95. Am I right on that?
That's correct.
For free. Tom Horn, crazy guy, he's throwing in a journal, which on its own, most of these retail for $20 on their own. So this journal is to help you start writing your story. When you buy the book, not only are you going to be enrolled in this, and you can send in your story, but you'll get a plastic pony, you'll get a journal of your own, and the proceeds from the book are going to help fund the studio we're building for Skywatch Women, and Nita Horn is going to be one of our panel members.
The 10 authors who are selected for the anthology, published by Defender Publishing in time for Christmas, will also receive a $500 cash prize.
That'll go a long way at Christmas time, won't it?
Yes, it will. Even if your story is not one of those selected for the anthology, if you've taken the time to write your story, you've left a legacy for your children and for your grandchildren.
Amen to that.
For complete instructions and details on this opportunity, please log on to skywatchtv.com/nofences.
And we are back. We're talking about extra dimensions and Flatland and Jesus and
walking through walls and eating food.
Yeah, all this really awesome stuff, and what it might be like for us when we get our new bodies. Now, one absolutely fascinating vision that this has. I've read this chapter of the Bible possibly more than any other chapter because it blows my mind. The first chapter of the book of Ezekiel talks about this amazing vision that Ezekiel had, and I've always known, reading it, that there was something to it. There was something more than what appears on the surface. But it wasn't until I started looking into things with quantum physics, some of this stuff started making sense. One thing we probably should get into is what extra-dimensional unfolding is. Now, this is the idea of another way to show a Flatlander what a three-dimensional object would look like. Say you take a cube. If you were to just place a cube on Flatland, the Flatlander would only see a square. But if you were to unfold the cube, and to where all the planes of the cube were flat on Flatland, it would take the shape. It would actually take the shape of a cross, but there would be 6 squares that the Flatlander could, inspect, and that's the way to give him the most information possible about the cube. Now, the Flatlander isn't going to be able to put it together in his head and understand that it's a cube.
Right.
He's not going to be able to get that at all.
He's
but
going to see some squares.
He'll just see the squares, but he'll have access to the most information possible. So that's called extra-dimensional unfolding. Now imagine, and we'll get into why this is important briefly because we're already running out of time. This goes by so fast. But imagine if you were to take a tesseract, which is a hypercube that's unfolded into 3 dimensions. So you have a 4-dimensional hypercube, you unfold it into 3 dimensions, and you have what's called a tesseract, which looks like a 3-dimensional cross with 2 extra arms. It's 8 cubes in total, because we're talking about an extra dimension, so you get 2 more than you would with the 6 squares from a 3-dimensional cube. Now, imagine if you take that tesseract and you try to unfold it again to where a Flatlander would understand. Well, now you got a problem, because you're going to start to have some of the squares take up the same space as other squares.
And start folding in on itself.
And they're going to meld and blend together. Well, that surprisingly, is exactly what we see in Ezekiel's vision. When he describes these angels, some of them share, they all share like the same leg and a hoof, and some of them, like one of them has like a half lion, half man face, and their wings are melded together. And interestingly enough, when you read through Ezekiel's vision and try to visualize it, it's almost the shape of a tesseract.
Right, almost, yeah.
Yeah, because you have their arms are all out, and there's 4 of them, so you have all 4 sides, and then their legs and torso and up to the head where they're carrying the throne of God. It's like the throne of God is on top of a tesseract.
Yeah. Yep.
So we're at least dealing with something that was unfolded twice, which would be two unfoldings into our dimension, which would make it 5th spatial dimensional.
Yep. So he was actually seeing a 5th spatial.
At least. It could be more, but at least.
It was at least broken down into what a 5th spatial dimension thing would look like.
Yeah. Yeah, mind-blowing stuff. There are also accounts of angels doing some really miraculous things. Some kind of brutal, but needed to be done. 2 Kings 19:35. This is where it talks about this massive slaughter by a single angel. It says, "And that night the angel of the Lord went out and struck down 185,000 in the camp of the Assyrians. And when people arose early in the next morning, behold, these were all dead bodies." So, amazing.
Yeah, exactly. How did it happen?
Extra dimensions.
Extra
Because
dimensions.
if we think about the Flatland example again, imagine how easy, if we were so inclined to do so, how easy it would be for us to slaughter Flatlanders.
Just get your hand in there and just wipe them out.
It would, and they would have no defense because what could they do?
They didn't see it coming. They only see what's in front of them.
Exactly.
We could go from behind.
If we're operating in the 3rd dimension, I could just face a Flatlander while he's facing in the only direction he can face, and shoot him or stab him or whatever it takes to do. But you could do that with 100,000 or as many as it takes, so they would have no defense. And I think that we have an example of that here.
Exactly.
And this isn't trying to diminish the overall power and might of angels, but maybe help explain how they can actually do some of these things.
Absolutely, because they're outside of this dimension.
You know what's interesting too, and this isn't anything, at least that I know of, that's actually in the Bible, but it's just kind of a logical assumption, I guess. If we think about Flatland, how a Flatlander, to see a square, a Flatlander would have to go all the way around the square to see all sides of it. We can look down at a square and see all sides at the same time.
Exactly.
That makes me think that if I have a cube, a 4th dimensional being would be able to look down at the cube from the 4th dimension and see all sides of it at once.
Yeah, we've talked about this. There's things that we're probably going to be able to comprehend in the higher dimensions looking down, like inside of a box. We had the cans of pop there. We'll be able to look down, probably see everything from all sides, even inside this opaque closed box.
Yeah,
and seeing the fluid and be able to comprehend that, that's completely normal.
That's the same, because that's the same with the Flatland thing. If there's a square and something inside that square, a Flatlander can't see it.
No,
we can see it just by looking.
Right, absolutely.
And I think it's the same for angels or any extra dimensional.
It makes perfect sense. That very well can be the case.
Yeah,
and
they can see inside of objects without having to actually be there.
Right.
Mind-blowing stuff. Man, we only got about a minute left, and I know that there was more that we wanted to talk about, so we'll have to probably save that for the next episode. We're going to talk more about the term extra-dimensional and and the term spiritual, and how they're actually synonymous, but not everybody comes at it from the same direction. We come at it from a Christian perspective based on the Bible. Scientists, it depends on the scientists, but they're more materialistic usually. But there's also Gnostics, New Age occultists that come at it from a totally different arena. So
weird place.
We're going to be talking a little bit about that next week. So don't miss it. Where can people find the show?
Again, you can go to skywatchtv.com, or you can visit us on YouTube at skywatch or youtube.com/skywatchtv_official.
You got it?
I got it.
All right, you got it out there. All right. So again, next week we will be talking about science at odds with theology, how we as Christians can process some of these things, and even how we can talk to maybe atheists that we know, or more materialists, people who don't have any kind of spirituality, how some of these things can be helpful in reaching out to the lost. So make sure to catch us next week on YouTube and Roku. As always, thank you for joining us in the multiverse. Yes. And until next week, take care and God bless.
From the time she was little, Nita dreamed of horses. Every childhood fantasy rode on the back of a heroic white steed, coming to save the day.
I don't know how long I've had this love in my heart for horses. It's just always been there. And when we were little girls, my sister and I would play all day long. I was always the white horse and she was always the little pink pig.
Let's pretend Lightning and Rosie can fly.
But everything changed in a heartbeat. On December 9th, 1971, a tragic car accident claimed the life of my dad and my best friend and my little sister. And I wondered after that if there was anything left to believe in.
Move aside, let the ambulance through. Please move aside.
As a child of 13, I felt like I had lost practically everything. And I wondered, is this it? I mean, where do I go from here? I could not have imagined back then how God could use horses, of all things, to restore my faith and vision for the future.
Starting April 19th, get your copy of Nita Horn's inspirational new book, No Fences, and learn for the first time her amazing story of loss, survival, determination, and healing. How the vision and love God gave her for these beautiful and majestic animals eventually led to the 150-acre Whispering Ponies Ranch, a general retreat facility, as well as a premier training location that specializes in using and gifting therapeutic animals to benefit the herding. Other care facilities, schools, and ministries across the nation.
When God puts something in your heart, it's there for a lifetime.